The most coffee are back. I feel very privileged to open this session now related to tax. Maybe I should start introducing myself. I'm Pascal Saint-Amans. I'm the new director for the Center for Tax Policy and Administration. I'm in my first days in office. I started on the 1st of February, so it's quite exciting to be here today on something which I attach a lot of importance to the extent that the relationship with non-OECD countries will be my key priority as the new director. So it's very important for me to attend this global forum on development. Prior to joining, or prior to be appointing the head of CTPA, I was the secretary of the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information, which I think is something like a model in terms of engaging non-OECD countries, as we currently have 108 countries all on an equal footing, participating to the debate on an equal footing. So that's a good direction we could all head to. I have two tasks today. One will be to introduce the distinguished panelists who will talk about the link between domestic resource mobilization and how to spend it and make sure that there is effective spending with effective governance. But also I wanted to quickly report on the progress made over the past 2 years. Remember that 2 years ago, this global forum focused primarily on tax, domestic resource mobilization, to use the G20 language. You know that there is one of the pillars of the G20 development working group is about domestic resource mobilization, which I think is pretty good language to designate what we're talking about. And since 2010, some significant progress has been made, because we have established, in terms of process, now in terms of outcome, we'll see and we'll discuss, but in terms of process, we have at the OECD established a task force, an informal task force on tax and development, which is a multi-stakeholder informal body where we do have international organizations. All the major international organizations are part of it. A number of governments, OECD countries, non-OECD countries, development world. And when I talk about government, it's an inclusive approach with the tax people, but also the aid people, the agency, the donors agencies, and so on. And we also have, and that's very important, and we attach a lot of importance to it, we also have NGOs which are present and vocal, hopefully, and we also have the business which is present, because the task force aims at addressing a number of issues which were identified 2 years ago here, and the aim of the task force is to try to optimize the assistance we can provide to help mobilize the resources with a few projects on transfer pricing, for instance. And what I aim at doing is to feed the OECD reflection on the standard settling from these experience, in order for us to take into account the needs and the specificities of developing countries when we do establish the standard, so that it's a standard which is useful and implementable by all countries. Second, try to address what we call the ineffective tax incentives for investment, and we had a subgroup not long ago, a subgroup meeting here not long ago, with very good experience sharing from Senegal. One of them saying that there was significant money wasted there, and there was some calculation made by the commissioner of Senegal. I don't remember how many points of GDP were lost in ineffective tax incentives, but that was really interesting, and I think we can make progress there in terms of advising developing as well as developed countries, by the way. Also ensuring greater transparency through exchange of information, therefore the link with the Global Forum, but also in terms of financial reporting from multinationals. So that's for the task force, but we also have decided to feed all the initiatives with the perspectives from developing countries. For instance, I think earlier today this was mentioned, we have what we call the Oslo Dialogue, which is how can we make sure that there is better cooperation among all the agencies against corruption, against money laundering, against tax fraud, and how can we make all these people work together more effectively, and that also will link with the STAR initiative of the World Bank and some others. How do we make sure that we do collectively have an impact, and not only for developed countries, but also for developing countries? We'll have a meeting in Rome mid-June where developing countries will be present, emerging economy as well. The minister in charge of fighting corruption, the new minister in Tunisia, will be speaking. That's one of the examples. This year's Global Forum, as you've seen from the agenda and the early presentation this morning, is focusing on how we can put in place a virtuous circle of effective public service and tax compliance. How do we make this link between revenue collection on the one hand and effective public service delivery on the other hand, and therefore these two questions, the link of domestic resource mobilization to service delivery, how can we ensure the effectiveness of that link? And second question for the panelists, how can the international development community help there? To respond to these questions, we have the privilege of having four speakers. I will start with Odd-Helge. I hope the pronunciation is not too bad. He's based at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway. He's an economist focusing on public sector reforms. He's an extensive experience from Eastern Southern Africa, I understand, and he's also a research director of the International Center for Tax and Development, ICTD. So he will speak first. Then we'll have Vito Tanzi. I'm not sure it's that helpful to introduce him. You all know him, former deputy minister in Italy, former head of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, former professor and chairman of the economics department, American University in Washington, D.C. He didn't bring his last book with him. I wanted to advertise it, but it's Governments versus Market, the Changing Economic Role of States, published in 2011. Vito is well known. Attiya Waris is also well known from here. I was asking her whether she had a permanent establishment in Paris, because she comes quite often, and I would like to thank her for that. She's a senior lecturer at the School of Law of the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and she's an advocate to the High Court of Kenya. She's also the vice chair of the Tax Justice Network and an active civil society member of the OECD's Task Force on Development that I previously referred to. She works on many areas, including the work on human rights. She worked in the Arusha Court of Justice, and she also worked on tax law, being a tax expert. Ben Kagarama has joined us. I would like to thank him in particular because he came a bit at the last minute, even though his schedule is very busy. Ben is Commissioner General of the Rwanda Revenue Authority, and he's also a member of the Council of the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, that you all know well, and he's one of the OECD's closest partner, and he will be making a presentation on both ATAF, but also, I hope, on Rwanda's experience, which is quite fascinating. I think I have enough spoken so far, and I would like to turn to Odd for him to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for the introduction, and I move straight to the topic, which is how to build a social fiscal contract by establishing better links between tax payment and public expenditure. I should say that my reference point, much of the empirical work I refer to, is from Eastern and Southern Africa, where I've been working on tax-related issue for almost 20 years now. It is widely recognized now that tax systems can contribute significantly to shaping accountability relationships and strengthening state capacities. And there are strong arguments in the literature that better links between tax payment and public expenditures are essential to building effective and accountable states. The main proposition of the fiscal exchange theory is that bargaining our taxes is central to building relations of accountability between state and society based on mutual rights and obligations. And in this perspective, taxation and the provision of public goods and services are interpreted as a contractual relationship between taxpayers and the government. But for taxation to have a positive effect on accountability, taxes must be felt by a majority of citizens. You need a broad tax base. And this understanding of the links between taxation and public expenditure is about now to become mainstream in the literature, and also it is moving towards the practice of taxation and development. But still, there is a tendency for the revenue and expenditure sides of the public finance equation to be treated as separate silos. The links between tax payment and public service delivery is in general very weak in many developing countries, and again my reference point is mainly East and Southern Africa. And this is often reflected in widespread resistance to pay taxes. A number of citizen surveys, they reflect the view that people feel they receive very little in return for taxes paid. So poor service delivery is, in taxpayers' view, legitimation of evasion and avoidance. And further on, the tax base is very narrow. There are very few registered taxpayers, and to achieve this accountability link between taxation and accountability, taxpayers must have a formal link to the government system, being registered. For instance, in Tanzania, in 2008, there were 400,000 approximately registered taxpayers. That doesn't mean that there are only those. Many of those 400,000 are actually not paying taxes, and we know that there are a large number of people who are not registered as taxpayers who pay taxes, for instance, indirectly through the VAT system. But this formal accountability link is missing. Norway, for instance, maybe not a good example. In 2010, there were more than 400 million tax forms reported back to the government. Tanzania has around 44 million people, while Norway has 5 million people. So there is a huge gap here between what is actually the tax base. And we know the burden on registered taxpayers is very, very high in many African countries. For instance, around 70–80% of the total tax take in some countries comes from very small number of companies. And the tax burden on those who pays actually can be very high. We're knowing also that the exemption regime is a part of the story here. Large segments of taxpayers are not, of the registered taxpayers are exempted or granted tax incentives. Capacity constraints of the tax administration only explains a part of this picture. And as I mentioned, the main challenges to enhance domestic revenues and also broaden the tax base are political and outside the control of the revenue administration. And that refers also to the tax exemption regime and tax holiday regime, as well as to the taxation of transnational companies. Transfer pricing has already been mentioned as one of the challenges which OECD now is addressing. So in this setting, what can developing countries do? And it should be underlined and emphasized there are very many positive developments, in particular when it comes to the development of the national or central government revenue administration. But despite this variety of tax systems which are found in the developing world, there is in one very important sense, all developing countries do face the same basic challenge. That is how to meet public spending needs by raising revenue in a way that is not only economically sustainable, but also administrative and political feasible. So for a country to have a better tax system, it must first have a political system in the sense of one that transforms citizens' preferences into policy decisions as efficiently as possible. So neither representation without taxation nor taxation without representation provides a sound basis on which to erect a fiscal system that will be both economically and politically sustainable in the long run. The challenge for many countries is not only to tax more, that is to increase the tax to GDP ratio, but to tax a larger number of citizens and enterprises more consensually. And this is not easy for various reasons, including economic structure and history. But nonetheless, historical and contemporary experiences show that taxpayers' behavior can be transformed by reforming the tax and expenditure system, leading to both a greater willingness to pay and an increased propensity to mobilize demand for better public services. So, how can developing countries strengthen the social fiscal contract? Well, tax policy is a part of the story. Addressing tax exemption is a major challenge. In some countries, IMF has also estimated that the lost revenues due to exemptions may represent up to 4 or 5% of GDP. And tax holidays is part of the story here. There seems to be a race to the bottom in some countries in Africa, and resource-rich countries in particular, to grant the most generous tax incentives to attract foreign investors. And in some contexts, we know that tax incentives may be important, but there are also evidence which clearly suggests that show that the tax rates are only one and often not the major incentive to attracting investors. A more predictable tax system is more important often, and as well as political stability. Having said that, it is also important, I think, when we are talking about the exemption regime, one should also look into the donor community's exemption regime. I know there has been a dialogue within the International Tax Dialogue on the issues of tax exemption. There is a fierce resistance from some to abolish the exemptions of donors. We also know that many NGOs are exempted from taxation. And there is an inconsistency here between, at one time, in one setting, they argue for the importance of collecting more revenues to be able to fund public services. At the same time, they are claiming tax exemptions. So here, look also into yourself, how you are using or exploiting the tax regime. Can you do something to change this, both as donors and civil society organizations? There has been a lot of efforts and a lot of improvements in the national in building the national tax administration. Revenue authorities has flourished, mushroomed in many African countries, and some are performing very well, including also we have a representative here from Rwanda. And Rwanda Revenue Authority is a very interesting case also, how you have managed both to raise revenues, but also in the building this, moving towards building a social fiscal contract. What is required is more specialized tax expertise in many of the revenue authorities. there is a need, certainly, to build specialized tax audit expertise in more complex sectors involving transnational companies, extractive industries, telecommunication, finance, and banking sectors. And that is also taking place in some countries. For instance, in Zambia, Zambia Revenue Authority is now working to build up specialized in-house expertise on mining tax audits in partnership with the IMF and the Norwegian Tax Administration. There is also a substantial need to strengthen the to engage more with international networks of taxation, including the African Tax Administration Forum, which is a forum where one can share lessons and experiences. And also to strengthen inter-organizational collaboration between governance bodies. A major challenge is to achieve sharing information between different government bodies. For instance, the Ministry of Mining and the Ministry of and the Revenue Administration there is often a dealing in the exchange of information, poor information sharing. The same with national and subnational bodies. And there is also a number of efforts which one can draw lessons from. For instance, to engage with networks that links the tax and expenditure side of public budgets. We have the Supreme Audit Institutions in Africa, which is working with revenue authorities, and also with CAPRI, a budget transparency agency. And then it is essential also to take forward to continue the work to build accountability mechanism. Firstly, to strengthen parliamentary and other institutional oversight bodies of the tax system. Parliamentarians are often fiscal illiterate. There is a need to both to strengthen their capacity to understand how budgets are formulated, what are their role when it comes to approving or disapproving proposals for tax reforms. And here there are cases from Africa which are worth looking into. For instance, Caritas, an NGO, has conducted training courses for parliamentarians in Zambia, in Tanzania. The Tanzania revenue authorities have done the same. And there are now also a much more vibrant debate in some countries on tax reform, budget, and the link between taxation and budgeting. There is also a need to encourage media and civil society attention to taxation. The civil society has done, in many countries in Africa, done a tremendous job when it comes to to address the challenges of transnational taxation of multinational companies within extractive industries in particular. But the engagement around the broader issues of taxation has to a large extent been ignored. And that is the next step here, to focus much more on the broader tax system, not only on extractive industries. There is also a need to improve the link between taxes and services received. And so I will just reflect briefly on tax earmarking. The most explicit form of earmarking is benefit taxation. That is charging for a particular service in order to provide the same service. Other forms of earmarking are much less direct. For example, when a specified share of income tax revenue is earmarked for transfers to local government. In both cases, the attraction of earmarking is that it can regularize spending on essential tasks and create greater transparency about the connection between taxation and public spending. And by doing so, it can give taxpayers a say over how revenues is spent. However, much of the public finance literature and many fiscal experts advise against earmarking. And one reason is that earmarking reduces fiscal flexibility in the long term. And perhaps more importantly, in practice, many tax earmarks serve a political purpose, but do not actually affect spending patterns or improve monitoring. The most common problem arises from the fact that revenues are highly fungible, meaning that newly earmarked revenues can be offset by shifting existing revenues to other priorities, and thus leaving the aggregate pattern of spending unchanged. And such behavior can actually undermine public confidence in the tax system. But despite these critiques, and now I'm trained as an economist, so I hold my nose and to avoid the smell, but I think there is important to consider the case for using tax earmarking in developing countries more extensively to build a fiscal contract. So people in the face of political instability, earmarking can stabilize funding for priority needs, which is the case, for instance, when it comes to road funds funded by fuel taxes. But second, and more importantly, from a governance perspective, tax earmarking may be a useful strategy for building trust and achieving important revenue and spending objectives, improving monitoring and increasing public engagement. And there are experiences from some at the subnational level which suggest that this can make a sense to move in that direction, to build stronger links between revenues, tax payment, and the expenditure side. For instance, in Lagos, Nigeria has done very interesting experience with that raised local revenues substantially and also improved service delivery. The same took place in Dar es Salaam in the late 90s. Finally, how can the international community support developing countries? Well, in setting priorities, the starting point must be an understanding of the vastly changed context in which tax and budgetary reforms are being pursued, and external support is being provided. There is now a much wider appreciation of the importance of taxation in development, and many more donor agencies and governments are active in the field. But unfortunately, this is now associated with frequently unhealthy competition among different aid and development agencies. At the level of individual developing countries, an unhealthy competition for individual aid donors to fund tax agencies, often on a small scale, is growing. Mozambique is one case. And this poses serious problems of duplications, wasted effort, and fragmentation, with the latter potentially undermining reform efforts by diverting local resources, reducing local ownership, and also undermining the coherence of reform programs. It is therefore very important that the engagement...
I will ask you to come to a conclusion.
It is therefore extremely important that the international community addresses this issue and establishes more coordinated efforts. And the OECD and the IMF here have certainly a role to play. Thank you very much.
Well, I should start by saying that I'm very happy to participate in this conference. I've been associated with OECD in some way for maybe almost 30 years. I participate in the Committee on Fiscal Affairs for 20 years. I came to Paris twice a year when I was at the fund. I want to take an opportunity to give a little bit of a background on the past 50 years in economic development, the relationship between economic development and taxes. It occurred to me then when I saw that this was the 50th anniversary, that was exactly 50 years ago that I started to be interested in economic development. When I was a young student at Harvard, I went to Washington to work for what used to be called the Joint Tax Program, which was a program of the UN, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Organization of American States, financed by the Alliance for Progress, by the Kennedy period, to develop tax systems in Latin America. And that's when I was first introduced to this. So it gives me a chance to think back about the last 50 years. In the 1940s and the 50s, the United Nations alerted the world to the wide differences that existed in per capita income between developed world and developing world. Up to that time, they had a feeling that there were differences, but numerically, this was the first time that they became aware. Then foreign aid and technical assistance came into being to assist the developing countries. Immediately, once this difference was realized, people said, well, we need aid and we need technical assistance. Tax experts moved from developed countries to developing countries, mainly from the US, also the UK, Holland, and a few other places, to advise, to teach the developing countries how to raise taxes. they normally try to create tax systems that were similar to those in the countries where the experts came from. At that time, the personal income tax was the most popular tax, was considered the fairest of all taxes. So inevitably, the experts tried to introduce the personal income taxes in developing countries, and of course, they wanted these taxes to be productive and to be progressive too at the same time. This was a time when the capital accumulation, that is the investment, was considered the main factor in promoting development. This was a time for economists in the room, arrow de domar time. You know, you had a machine, you put capital on one side and growth came from the other side. Where private investment could be stimulated by tax incentives, so you need a lot of incentive taxes, and public investment required resources, of course. The developing countries were advised, therefore, to increase the tax system, the tax levels, to provide tax incentive to private investment, to keep current spending low, because it was considered unproductive, and with the current surplus generated in the public accounts, to increase the public investment in physical infrastructures. This was considered a sure recipe to promote growth. So infrastructure investment, private investment, and this would bring growth. Soon problems or doubts developed. Raising taxes, especially personal income taxes, proved difficult. You know, it became more and more difficult to really do this. Public investment turned out to be less productive than anticipated. The capital output ratios were very high, or marginal capital output ratio. Now we don't talk anymore about this, but there was a time you talk all the time about this thing. Tax incentives were stimulating the wrong private investment and encouraging corruption. So some economists started to point out that current public spending, especially for education and health, the kind that Nora was talking about, could be as productive as public investment in infrastructure. Other economists started calling attention to the importance of the quality of public institutions. This was a time when Douglas North and so got Nobel Prizes for public institutions, etc., for pursuing a good economic policy. The institution, think of it, they are the vehicles that carry the policies. So you can have a good policy, but if you don't have an institution that carries it, the policy will not have much of an effect. So some attention shifted from policies to institution. Tax administration obviously attracted a lot of attention. There was a time when the computer came and people thought that simply by buying computer you would be able to improve tax administration. Education spending was seen as essential for improving income distribution. It was believed that higher literacy would lead to better genius. You know, this was an article of Faith at some time in the 80s or so. Literacy went sharply up, but income distribution did not change much in most countries. So this was another disappointment, you know, something that we firmly believe did not generate what we expected. Tax system and tax reform continue to receive much attention to make the system more productive, more efficient, and more equitable. There was a lot of technical assistance was provided to developing countries by international organizations and by some government. I don't know how many tax missions I've been on, you know, over the years. There was some progress in tax structure. This is very important, probably has not been emphasized much. The tax structure improved significantly. Taxes on foreign trade became progressively less important. This was very important. Excise taxes became more concentrated on few items, gasoline, etc. The value-added tax became a universal tax, almost universal tax, and was highly productive. These were very important changes. However, the share of taxes in the GDP did not change much on average. The average is important. Of course, countries like Brazil and a few others did very well. But on the average, it remained around 18% of GDP for the developing countries as a group. The revenue importance of the personal income tax did not change also. We convinced ourselves at some point that we should give up on this. And if I had more time, I would elaborate. Next Monday, I'm speaking at the European Commission, making this the point that the The architecture of the tax system was damaged dramatically in the 80s when globalization forced countries to lower the taxes on income and concentrate on others, but I don't have the time to go into that. Personal income taxes remain unproductive and not particularly equitable. The low tax revenue was often attributed to high tax evasion. Also on this, I have my doubt, whether tax evasion is all as important as it may to be. I've convinced myself the tax law have much more to do with the low tax rate than tax evasion. It's not that the tax evasion does not exist, but very often it's tax evasion by very poor people. No, the idea of having a mass income tax, for example, in developing countries, is an illusion. The top 1% or 5% accumulate so much income that you really have to focus on them. Over the years, many economists gave up on the possibility that the tax system could play a significant role in improving the income distribution of most countries and shifted their attention to spending. So there was at one point we have moved, and this is the main theme of the conference. Many came to believe that the changes in the income distribution could be achieved more easily from the spending side of the budget by giving more importance to particular categories of spending. For the category that had not received much attention in the 50s and 60s, health and education, now received a lot of attention later on. For advanced countries, the focus was on total public spending. For developing countries, it was on more focused spending. There's some theory about advanced countries that if you want to redistribute income, you just spend more because everybody will benefit. But for developing countries, you have to be much more focused than that. This change of emphasis raises several questions. How efficient are governments in their spending activities? How good are the existing public expenditure management systems? Do they protect spending allocation from the influence of elections or personal, political, religious, or tribal connections, from corruptions? Do the statistical studies on the incidence of public spending take account of inefficiency? In fact, this is really something that has bugged me for almost 40 years. I wrote a paper in 1972, which was published in the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro Quarterly Review, which was a major journal at that time in 1974, making the point that much of the expenditure for education, really, you can do two things. You can allocate the expenditure to the children. And if the children are poor, you allocate all expenditure to the benefit of the poor. But if there's a lot of inefficiency, school teachers that don't show up, that supply that disappear and so forth, the real benefit to the poor is very small. There is a very large part which is inefficiency, which must be allocated to who benefits from them. And those who benefit from them very often are not the poor. They are the middle classes that deliver the systems. So is it true that it is easier to redistribute income from the spending side than from the revenue side of the budget? Is there convincing evidence for this notion? I'm not sure that there is. At the margin, as Nora pointed out, clearly you can show that if you have a focused program that they help very poor, there's some benefit from that. But in terms of major changes in the income distribution, I'm not sure. I think that we have given up too quickly on the redistributive impact of taxes. I think that the taxes should have to play a larger role. Unfortunately, as I already mentioned, globalization has made much more difficult. It's made much easier to say that you cannot tax capital or financial capital or high income because they are mobile and they have to move away from this. So since I'm running out of time, I should conclude that maybe we should pay much more attention to the international implication of taxation. Tax evasion has moved from being a national problem to being a global problem. Much of tax evasion today is not evasion of the poor guy who's selling some little things at the local market. It's about evasion by people who put the money in Miami or elsewhere, or transfer pricing, etc. So to conclude, maybe I'm just jumping on this, perhaps to come with an idea that has been bugging me, at least for the past 17 years. Maybe we need a world tax organization. Think of it, we have a World Trade Organization which takes care of protecting, reducing tax protection through customs. Well, the emphasis has shifted from import duty and quantitative restriction to the tax system. We are doing exactly the same thing to the tax system, but there is no organization now that formally, on a larger scale, I realize that Pascal's activity is very important, and I want him to become the head of the World Tax Organization. But it has to be an organization which has the full backing of an institution, and it has to be, it has to include all countries. You cannot have a rich country telling the poor country what to do. They have to develop the system all together. Well, since I ran out of time, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vito. Some trade-off to negotiate afterwards. Attiya, please.
Without trivializing the World Tax Organization, I can see a campaign coming from civil society to set up tax auditors without borders to counter any effect. I'm sorry. That's my civil society half talking. The whole purpose of why we're here is the tax spending and connecting it to taxation. And what occurred to me as I started to look at this issue was I'd almost want to turn it on its head and say the spending before taxation, which might make some people cringe, but let's see how it works, perhaps. So I have more of a grassroots perspective as well as a top-down perspective, since I do a lot of work in law and society and how they intermingle. But one thing I'd like to point out before I go ahead is I've got to split, for me, I have to split taxation into the recurrent expenditure and, of course, the development part, or the progressive part of it, as I would call it. And if I split those two apart, I will keep in mind that education and health also have recurrent expenditure within the recurrent arm of government. So there are elements of development that are a little bit fuzzy and on both sides of the fence. And so I started to think about how would one begin to quantify this. And I can't quantify this unless I split states into different groups. And the presentation on Latin America and how they're broken up into different groupings was quite interesting, because I would split them into 4 groups. The countries that don't really have any taxation but then don't have any services. I would think in terms of states that are in conflict. I'd also talk about states that have just got independence, or it's immediate post-conflict states. So I'm thinking in terms of South Sudan, Somalia, to a certain extent Zimbabwe during the sanctions, because also there wasn't a lot of access to information there. So there are those types of states. That would be my first level. Second level of states would be what are commonly called in taxation as domain states or tribute states. And these would be states with semi-feudal systems. So there are countries in the world that do still have this. Pakistan has a sort of feudal system. Bangladesh has it as well to a certain extent. So not completely taxed, still a lot of elements of having warlords or a mafia of sorts that have taken over. In my country, we have a semblance of a mafia that gives services in return for money, which is basically they give you security. Italian mafia come to mind, but those are sort of the connections I would make at the second level. At the third level would be a country that actually levies a tax, but a tax that is well understood, but not necessarily a tax that has a connection to services directly. And for a very long time, tax scholars and theorists have fought the ability of people to link tax to spending. Probably, although we're discussing this link, this is the one part where we have the greatest problem. States talk about their sovereignty, and the biggest debate in constitutional law is the power to tax or the right to tax. Now, depending on how you perceive it, you will either absolutely refuse to make that connection to spending, or you will say there's a right to tax, which means there's a responsibility. So that is the other linkage that would need to be made at that point. So that's kind of where I'm coming from broadly. And if you look at taxation, the spending and the collection, then there are several key points that come out, which have been mentioned by most of the speakers this morning, actually. Transparency, accountability, and responsibility. Effectiveness and efficiency has already come out quite clearly in the earlier 2 speakers. And I would add on fairness and justice. And this is the part which links the spending to the collection. Because if you flip it on its head, and this is my second point, if you flip it on its head, then you have an example like Rwanda. In 1994, and I will not presume to go into Ben's area, but in 1994, post-genocide, Rwanda had nothing in its treasury. But the question is, if we're going to link the collections to the spending, then there was no collection. There was only the need to spend, and there was nothing in the budget. He set up a lot of different systems. This is President Kagame, but one thing that I found very interesting was a one cow, a family policy. So if anybody here is from an agricultural background, this may have some linkages to your lives. Every family in the northern part of Rwanda was given a cow per family. He airlifted 60,000 cows into the country. So you basically had 60,000 families to date, I stand to be corrected, it may be more, that were granted a cow per family, which meant immediately the need for food was alleviated. What I did was I went and interviewed people in northern and eastern Rwanda because I wanted to ask them what the impact of it was. What I also found very interesting was that if a cow had a calf, the calf was given to the neighboring family that didn't have a cow yet. So it was not about enrichment, it was about spending that achieved a certain level of poverty alleviation within the country. And I asked them whether they would be willing to pay 50 cents a year, 50 cents European, a year as tax, and they said yes. Then I asked €1 a year, they said yes. I said €1.50, they said yes. I said €2. Now we were moving away from the willing taxpayer to the unwilling taxpayer. So I stopped there. But what really got me going was this was a population out in the northern part of the country that didn't realize that they pay VAT. So they had no connection in their minds that they were taxpayers. But now they had this cow that was granted to them by government, spending was involved, and now the revenue can flow in. And I think that Rwanda is a perfect case of a country where now taxation can begin to gain root because the population is amenable to the work that the state is doing to a certain extent. So the next thing I thought about was, well, we've got the spending and we've got the taxation coming in, but the missing link between the two is the literacy. If a population is unaware that you are spending on their behalf, they will not pay. So, for example, the Finnish government about 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, decided that every time they encourage development projects, they wouldn't put up a signpost saying, developed by the Finnish Development Aid Agency. They decided it had to be owned by the community and the state. And the repercussions of this, I think, are fantastic because even when the aid is coming in from the outside, sometimes the silence allows the creation of a connection in the minds of the society within the area that will turn around and say, yes, our state did this for us, therefore we are willing now to pay more tax. This is the sort of repercussion that's starting to happen on a broader level in my part of the world. In addition to that, if you improve taxation, you also end up improving spending. So improving the tax administration, which has been mentioned already, improving tax literacy, improving tax systems must go hand in hand with improving tax spending. So the Tax and Development Task Force is really great because there are a lot of new ideas flowing out on how to improve tax collection. But I think it's really important that while we're doing the tax collection part of it, we need to improve the tax spending part of it as well. Because with added resources, you will bump into inevitably the issue of corruption, which has also come up already. And these two must be balanced at all times. My next point is the connection to the international arena and how to go forward with it. I'm currently doing some research on health financing, which interestingly is pointing out to the unsustainability of the World Health Organization. And since international institutions have this common challenge of getting resources, the membership dues inevitably are a percentage of the tax collections in a state. So the amount that you pay in usually has a link to the amount your country produces. The more you produce, technically, the more you have to hand over. This has been the route for membership of international organizations, but there is almost a veil. So we are here at the OECD thanks to the taxpayer money of 30 30 countries that are OECD member states. That link, whether it's a developing country or a developed country, whether we're talking about the East African community, the African Union, or we're talking about ASEAN or the United Nations, that link between taxation and state representation is not very clear anymore, even in the minds of people both in developed and developing countries. And there is a need to begin to grow this and develop it a bit further. In addition, there is a possibility of how to find a solution. So I've talked about the tax collection and I've talked about the spending. But how do we quantify the spending in a way that society will understand it? And I believe that human rights, the Universal Declaration, international covenants, have found a way through the MDGs, and I know we're already talking post-MDG, but one thing that struck me about the human rights discourse was that you can now quantify in financial terms how much it will cost to put a pipe within 200 meters of a hut in a village anywhere in my continent. Now, the fact that I can quantify that means that I can put money on it. If I can put money on it, I can link it to taxation. Now, people at grassroots in most developing countries today understand the concept of human rights, or some concept of human rights. So it would be really interesting to actually begin to link together human rights discourse and development discourse, which is already linked together quite well, but now to taxation discussions, because human rights are still conceptualized as ideals. But the MDGs and their quantification allow us to make that link. Thank you, and I will be summing up now. So what is the way forward? The way forward for international institutions, I think, is to continue to push for international cooperation, for example, the OECD and ATAF, which is already being done currently. But I think the need to get peoples and states to recognize that really the state systems and international organizations are relying on taxpayer money will empower not only peoples in developing countries and developed states, but also empower states in certain scenarios. I also think that there is a need to improve the worldwide literacy on issues of taxation and development. And many people don't know that they pay taxes, and therefore will never know that their development is a result of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attiya. Ben, please.
Distinguished members of this forum, I'm sure you understand that I'm the most unfortunate speaking after everybody else. And basically, the language we are using is the same. So you might find a lot of my presentation very repetitive and boring, but just pretend that it is not repetitive and it's not boring and try to enjoy it. I'm here in two capacities. One, I'm here on behalf of the African Tax Administration, a forum in Africa that deals with the tax policy and then tax empowerment through the tax administration services in different countries. I'm also here on behalf of my own country, but something that I've just had to think about doing when I arrived here, because I did not think I was required to give country experience, but I'll try and do that. On behalf of the ATAF, and specifically the Executive Secretary who was invited to speak at this forum, I have this opportunity to share the views of ATAF, some of which are my own views, actually all of which are I share with. We believe that the need to tax revenue is arguably the most central activity of any state, and that revenue from taxation is what literally sustains the existence of a state through the provision of necessary financial resources for social and economic activity. We believe that taxation lies at the administrative heart of any government and provides the basis by which public goods are made available, and that is nothing different from service delivery. At the same time, we believe that taxation is also an avenue through which citizens are most directly connected to the state, making taxation an important catalyst for public demands with regard to a government's responsiveness and accountability. Governments relying mainly on tax revenue are more likely to be more accountable than those that rely on non-tax revenues from natural resource rents or from foreign aid. More than an instrument for raising revenues, taxation is essentially about people. It's about the citizens of a country and the relationship they have with the country they live in. Taxation touches the lives of citizens in many ways, whether they are taxpayers or not, and I think that has been already exemplified. And the way taxes are raised has an impact on the economically active, even those or non-active, including those who don't know that they are paying taxes, but the active one including employment, the employed, the corporations, small businesses, traders, and consumers. And for the different categories mentioned here, for them, rising tax revenues is about their economic cost, the quality of service they receive as the providers of revenue, and about the social benefits they receive as citizens. The way taxes are spent, that is expenditure, has an impact on the lives of citizens, and where expenditure is deemed to bring tangible benefits, it provides the citizens with the means for the state to govern, to pursue development activities, and provide social and economic needs of its people. It plays a role in fostering legitimacy and responsiveness. The amount and efficiency of government spending is an essential part of making domestic resource the engine for development. Recent developments have necessitated that taxes automatically account for almost all government revenues in many developing countries. And increasing tax revenue can therefore have a significant impact on improving domestic resource mobilization, provided it does so without discouraging or causing damage to private economic activity. Public revenue, therefore, should be mobilized in a way that preserves incentives for private sector actors to work and save. Talking about that, I'm very conscious of the impacts of negative incentives that have just been raised, but I wouldn't want to debate on that now. But I believe that any economic activity should also have incentives to private sector actors. Tax administrations have the potential to be a force for development, state building, and social cohesion, making a difference to the lives of millions of people. Strengthening domestic resource mobilization is not just a question of raising revenues. It is also about designing a tax system that promotes inclusiveness, encourages good governance and accountability of governments to their citizens. It should match society's views on appropriate income and wealth inequalities, and then promote social justice. A tax system design is also closely linked to domestic and international investment decisions, including transparency, anti-corruption, and fairness. Transparency and accountability are critical elements of domestic resource mobilization, aid, assistance, and economic governance. Improved transparency makes non-compliance more difficult both domestically and internationally, and thus enhances the integrity and credibility of a tax system. Citizens must be aware of the taxes they are paying and be educated about the system of taxation and budgeting, while government must be transparent about tax collection and public spending. Taxation improves a government's responsiveness and accountability and results in the provision of an excellent opportunity or incentives for citizens and government to enter into a tax bargain or a fiscal contract. And through this process, citizens accept and comply with taxes in exchange for government providing effective services, the rule of law, and accountability. Tax bargains are mutually beneficial as citizens receive improved governance, while the government receives larger, more predictable, and more easily collected tax revenues. Attiya just exemplified the case for the Rwandan families she interviewed. And we believe that few, if any, governments have been able to implement highly effective tax systems without meeting into a national dialogue about taxation. Now, very quickly, I'll go through my own experience. Attiya, being a neighbor, knows as much as I do for my country. Immediately after the 1994 horrendous genocide in Rwanda, for which we are very, unfortunately, very famous, Rwanda had no budget and had no revenue. Government had to quickly move into the formation of a modern revenue agency. The Rwanda Revenue Authority started in 1998. And very quickly, I'll go through this. Today, it has turned into a model revenue organization, contributing 52% of tax to budget revenue and contributing 13.5% of tax to GDP. Rwanda has registered impressive growth with an annual average of 7.5% and with 2011-2012 projected at 8%. The reasons for these successes, I just talked about transparency and accountability. We have done very, very simple things, and mostly they have been aimed at inducing tax compliancy. We have a normal process of tax education that is aimed at obtaining compliancy. We have an annual celebration of the Taxpayers Appreciation Day for purposes of accountability, and the head of state always presides. For the past 12 months, he has not simply missed a single occasion. He's given a report from the Commissioner General about actual tax collection, about usage, and then he awards certificates for compliance. He reports on the allocations. We just heard about priority allocations if you have scarce resources. And the biggest share so far of our national budget has gone into infrastructure, agriculture, education, and health. And we have also done simple things like building institutions. Here we are talking about regulators or governance. We have zero tolerance to corruption. We have institutions that implement this, the Ombudsman, the Auditor General for State Finances, and the Parliamentary Audit Committees. That's in terms of governance and regulation, and that ensures taxpayers are confident and sure that their money is well spent because they are these watchdogs, if you like, looking over them. But most importantly also is the expenditure or the redistribution element for service delivery. We have community development strategies that have induced compliance, if you like. And in our 2010-2011 EDPRS is the Economic Development and Poverty Reduction Strategies that was concluded last week, and we have just launched the 2012-2013. Studies indicated that poverty reduction through the provision of a number of things that I'll be listing shortly has benefited, our EDPRS processes has benefited the poor more through those transfers, and those transfers have been in the form of transfers for rural electrification and access to clean water, infrastructure development through road network and access, public schools, and free primary and secondary education, health insurance that is subsidized by all for all the citizens, the 1 cow per family campaign that has just been explained, I won't belabor on that, then the eradication of substandard housing, and security and freedom for both social and economic activity. I think an issue raised is how the international community should help. Ben, I've seen, I'll take only 1 minute. I would believe that the most effective way of helping developing countries is through a strategy that would sustainably ensure mobilization of resources. And usually when you look at what happens, this is a strategy that the international community has no appetite to invest in. That is infrastructure, including roads, railways, and airports, because these would allow policymakers to dream about mobilization, not based on a recurrent expenditure that we do mobilize our resources from. The other aspect, I think, should be technical and capacity building, which is being moved forward impressively. That's through audits, through legal design, including transfer pricing, and design of a tax policy system that guarantees investment in a stable tax system. I think more support also to development expenditure as opposed to financing recurrent expenditure. I thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks to all the speakers, but now I think it's time to turn to you to give you the floor for questions you may have for the speakers. So who would like to start? Please. Is there a microphone for the first row?
Okay, thank you. This is Marco De Ponte from ActionAid, and development organization, international development organization. I mean, I think we are discussing now, not for the first time, how important it is to make sure that there is accountability and transparency in how both taxes are raised and the revenues is spent. As a development organization, we do some work, including at the local level, starting from producing, opportunities for economic literacy of the citizens. And there's, there's quite a lot that we can do. We can talk to that if you like. Even tomorrow, I have a slot, and we'll expand on that. But I was very curious to hear the fact that some of you have been talking about earmarking taxation, revenues for spending that states at the both national and local level are raising. Nobody, if I understood it correctly, even mentioned the principle of fiscal subsidiarity, whereas administration is not only earmarking specific revenues for specific expenditure, but also gives the opportunity to citizens to decide, where a portion of their taxation or of their taxes should be spent at the source. And there are systems where this has been tried. There are arguments that say that this will, in itself, as a mechanism, improve the accountability and transparency and the social fiscal contract at large. So I'd like to hear a little bit your views on that, where it's been successful, if anything at all, and what level of that fiscal subsidiarity is advisable, because in a way, the state is also sort of giving up a little bit of its own responsibility when it decides that the most maybe fashionable things would be a resource as opposed to other things that would require resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We may take a couple of other questions before responding, just in the middle of the room there.
J'étais dans la conférence sur l'efficacité de l'AD en Busan. En Busan, il y a un grand protagonisme de la OECD, mais dans la déclaration finale, il y a un paragraphe avec la corruption. Mais il fait impossible d'écrire la lutte contre les paradis fiscaux. Alors, toutes les questions fiscales est une question nationale ou est la lutte contre les paradis fiscaux des fonds monétaires internationaux ou de l'OCDE en bla bla bla.
Blah, blah, blah will translate easily in English, so I don't have to translate this part of the question. We have another question over there, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Suleiman from the Parliament of Uganda, Budget Office, an economist. I have two issues. One is for Odd, I think, who talked about parliamentarians as illiterate, in terms of tax matters. Yeah, indeed, it's true. World over, I mean, in terms of tax matters, taxation, almost all parliaments are illiterate because parliaments are just a collection of people from all different professions. And my take on that, indeed, it's one of the challenges, especially as Attiya said, the issue of power to tax and the right to tax. In my own experience, most parliamentarians have appetite for spending, but a little incentive to tax because that's touching on their mandate, on the people whom they vote for. So the question I wanted to ask, how can we address this kind of dilemma? The appetite for spending in terms of the members of parliament wanting increased expenditure, and also themselves limiting the taxes. Then another issue is on capacity, especially at subnational levels. Now, you find that in most of the developing countries, taxation at subnational levels is not linked to the expenditures. And in most cases, as highlighted by most of the speakers, is that the tax collectors have little say in terms of the political decisions to spending. And I think that's where the problem lies. So as a way forward, I think the international community should invest more in terms of continuous tax education for all stakeholders so that people can understand the reasons why they pay the tax, and also to help the policymakers understand the need for a proper tax system and accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A last question, if any. Yes, on the almost the first row, my right-hand side, and then we'll respond to them.
Oui, bonjour. Donc, Simon Tetgat de l'assistance internationale. Alors, ma question s'adresse à M. Karagarma et Madame qui ont évoqué l'exemple du Rwanda. Alors, moi, j'aimerais savoir, parce que je suis extrêmement, comment dirais, très admiratif de ce qui s'est passé en Rwanda, malgré le drame que tout le monde connaît. Alors, j'aimerais savoir si l'Union africaine prend cet exemple et essaye de faire en sorte que les autres pays qui connaissent une corruption très, très ancrée et très ancienne s'inspire vraiment de l'exemple rwandais. Est-ce qu'il y a un effort de l'Union africaine vers le Rwanda pour sauver, entre guillemets, les autres pays? Merci.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. On va faire une seconde en français, on va prolonger. Donc je vais demander aux speakers, aux orateurs d'apporter des éléments de réponse aux 4 questions qui viennent d'être posées, peut-être en commençant par Odd, et puis on fera l'ordre des speakers, si vous pouvez répondre aux différentes questions qui ont été posées. Odd.
Thank you. Yeah, I got a direct questions on experiences where earmarking with taxes have been successful and where citizens have had then also been involved in this decision. First, I would say that earmarking of taxes is quite common. This is historically, if you read the tax literature and so on, you will see that earmarking has been very, very common in practice, although very much opposed by fiscal experts of several reasons. And this is very well documented in the literature. But the matter of fact, my argument for looking into the earmarking, the possibilities for more earmarking of taxes, is that we don't live in a first world world. We live in a second best world at best. That means that we must be very pragmatic and so on. And one of the challenges with respect to building a tax system and building stronger links between taxes and expenditures is that taxpayers in general in many countries, at least in the countries I've been working in Africa, are very, very reluctant, very, very opposed to pay taxes. Those who pay are mainly medium-sized, larger companies who are cannot avoid paying taxes. And then, as is said here, that there are a lot of people who pay VAT and they don't know about that. But there is resistance to expand the tax, to pay taxes. So the tax base in general, the registered number of taxpayers are very narrow. In one example, which this issue was raised, and a very concrete example is from Dar es Salaam, I mentioned that, which was experiences major problems to collect taxes from the residents. And then we are referring to local taxes in the form of business licenses, in the form of various levies. This was considered to be such a problem because a large chunk of these revenues were used to provide specific services in the city. So, and the national government, they actually abolished dissolved the elected, democratically elected city council because it said it's incompetent and an embarrassment for the country. This happened around 1995, and they installed a city commission whose task was to do something to shape up the city council. And the commissioner, city commissioner, he realized that he needed to establish a strong link, in particular with local business people, and make them understand that now the rules of the game had changed. Now it was a new regime which were promising to deliver. And he established a kind of you didn't use the word, but they established a fiscal contract where the business community agreed to pay taxes on the condition that they saw something in return. And they discussed concretely what they would give priority in the short run. And the priority was to improve safety, security in the city center, city lighting, cleaning, etc. And that was installed. And this system has contributed to a major change of the city center of Dar es Salaam, and also it contributed to improve the taxpayers' willingness to pay. That's one concrete example. Another example is in Lagos, Nigeria, which has been quite exposed, discussed in Nigeria, where the governor has also established similar mechanisms. So there are examples and cases where this is working, and I think we have to be more pragmatic, be more flexible, and not just staying stuck to what the theory is telling us. And a final point, I will say that one issue we hardly have touched upon, there was one question at the end, that is also the role of the importance of not ignoring the subnational level. We are focusing very much on a national level and also international dimension of taxation. They are very important from a revenue perspective. But when it comes to building more accountable relations between citizens and the state, the local government is essential. It's at the local government level that citizens directly interact with government bodies on a day-to-day basis, both with respect to local taxes and also spending. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on the local government, I was in Tunisia last week, and the government was explaining that the first taxes that people stopped paying during the revolution were the local taxes, because there was local governments there, which were the representatives of the central government, and the first thing they stopped paying was local tax, and we will be working with the European Union on how we can help there. In the OECD, we have a fiscal network, which is a way to look at the relationship between central and local governments and the transfer of taxes or subsidies, and that's a very interesting and quite key part, both in developed, emerging, and developing economies. Vito.
Yes, on the question of earmarking, I agree. On the question of earmarking, I agree completely with Odd. In a perfect world, with a rational government and total transparency, you should not have earmarking. The government should decide what to do, and that would be the rational allocation. But unfortunately, the world is not like that, and so the governments are not totally rational. They have biases, there's corruption, and because of that, sometime for a particular program, earmarking is important. Remember that fees are a form of earmarking. And we very often recommend a greater use of fees. The earmarking, the subsidiarity question is a little bit more complicated. This is a very controversial area. The fund and the bank, the IMF, the World Bank, they have been having a fight that has been going on for many years, because the World Bank thinks that more decentralization is always a good thing. Will promote growth, will promote transparency, will promote many things. Our experience was exactly the opposite, that as you go down, the public expenditure management system become much worse. You give money supposedly for schools, and the money is used to buy expensive cars or build swimming pools or whatever. So that has been, I don't know, which is, as I said, we've been having this debate with, we were having, I don't know whether the IMF still having the same debate when I was there with the World Bank. But my experience also looking what happens in my hometown in Italy. I live in the United States, but I spend a lot of time in Italy now. And when I go to my hometown, I see so many abuses. And the idea that the citizens are aware of all the decisions on regulation, on expenditure, etc., is really an illusion. A few days ago in the Italian government, they declared the incomes of the ministers and the undersecretary. I was an undersecretary there 8 years ago, and I was shocked to find out the level of income that these people were getting, And the trouble was that income don't come from formal salaries. They come from appointment to sit on the board of various institutions, and you never know about those. So the citizens are never going to know the full extent of what goes on, even at the local level. So this idea that decentralization and subsidiarity will solve the problem, I hope it is like this, but my own experience has not led me to conclude that that's the case. On the corruption, there was a question on corruption. Clearly, this is a major problem. You know, the world woke up to corruption around 1995, 96, and up to that time, a little attention had been paid to corruption. And now every day I open the Washington Post or New York Times or Financial Times, and there are stories about corruption everywhere. So it's not a question of developing countries or advanced countries, everywhere. One reason is that the world has become much too complex, and we have allowed the world to become much more complex. To give you one example, in the United States, there are today somewhere between 70 and 80,000 pages of laws and regulations related to the income tax. 70, 80,000. No. How on earth are you going to know what is in there? How many people know what is in that? You know? I have a son who worked for Bloomberg. You know, the other day when he drove me to the airport in Washington, he was telling me that two brothers in California who produce wine managed to have inserted in some law that nobody ever checked, that if you have two brothers both producing wine in California, you don't pay taxes. And well, that's the problem, that many of these things make their way in tax bills, which are 2,000 pages long. Nobody reads them, except the lobbyists who manage to have them inserted. So this is the world we are facing, and we have to really, in my book, the book that mentioned, I'm concluding. In the book, you know, the last 2-3 pages are that complexity will create a major, major problem in the future. The world was not always like this. You know, in the past, you have the tables on stone that told you the principle. Now we want to regulate everything. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left because lunch is being served in a couple of minutes. So if Attiya and Ben could conclude in a nutshell. Thank you.
I'll start from the back forward because I think that's easier. Actually, the OECD is doing some work on tax literacy, which I'm helping them with, and we're using Rwanda as the case study on the way forward for capacity building in developing countries. And I do see Rwanda as being a great model for the AU to take up on, and I hope that they do. But within the East African community, there's a policy of harmonization, which means that when one country is successful in the region, then the other countries start to emulate it. So we now have taxpayer days in the other parts of the East African continent, sorry, the East African region. I'm glad you said that Parliament has a problem. I think you're right, it's across the board. Everybody has a problem with literacy. I was desperately looking for budget documents in Kenya once, and a member of Parliament invited me to his office because he said he didn't need them. They were holding open his door. He just didn't know what to do with them, and they were massive. So this is a problem. You have people representing the people, but not necessarily having the knowledge in some of the areas, and it's important to move forward. Yes, tax havens are absolutely critical, but because we were asked to limit ourselves to the revenue and how to link it to the spending, I didn't go into the tax haven issue, but yes, it is critical on the spending side as well. And as far as earmarking is concerned, I know I'm racing. I think that there are certain points in time in the development of a state when it is actually quite critical to earmark not a large amount of money, but a certain amount of money in order to make that link between the society and the state, to show that here's the money, this is your money, we're using it to build this. And I think it has to be geared specifically towards something of a development nature, because if it's recurrent, then people will not really understand it. So that would be the limit of my thoughts on the earmarking. Thank you.
Ben, the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to thank the gentleman from the International Aid, I don't know which one, for admiring Rwanda. Thank you so much. Your question is, can the African Union use Rwanda as a model, and what efforts are being made to help others? Attiya just mentioned on a couple of things about harmonization of policies in the East African community. That's one of them. And we encourage everybody to benchmark. The Rwandan success story has been built on transparency and accountability. Like I said, we have governance structures in place, institutions that enforce this transparency and accountability. With the zero tolerance to corruption principle, we have enforcement agents like the Ombudsman, where, for example, every junior officer, for example, in my organization, a tax officer, is made to do an annual declaration of their assets. And you can improve on your assets, you can reduce them, but in cases of improvement, you have to justify the sources of income. So that is one way. We have the Auditor General for State Finances, looking at procurement and budgeting reallocations. And once issues are discovered, then these are forwarded to the Parliamentary Audit Committee, who will hold responsible the people using government budget in a way as they wish and like. So there are procedures that you have to follow, and you have to follow them to the letter. For example, as the chief budget manager, I have a limit to the kind of budget reallocation I can do. If I need the reallocation, I have to go to the Secretary of Treasury and say, yes, I have surplus budget here, and I want to allocate it like here. So those procedures are very well respected. Now, the other thing is about transparency and accountability. We have just launched what we call the citizens, and I know during the launch there was a debate that not everybody is a citizen, so we called it a client's charter. In the client's charter, everybody knows what service to receive, when to receive it, and by who, and at what cost, and how long it takes. And these issues, if you know what you want, they eliminate the possibility or incentives to corruption and misuse of public office. So these are some of the issues, some of the benchmarks that we would want to share with everybody. And yes, I would encourage the African Union to emulate Rwanda if you think Rwanda is the best example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm aware it's 1:15, so it's time to go for lunch. But I think the last example by Ben will actually feed not our stomachs yet, but the next session, which will start at 2:30 on enhancing the effectiveness of government expenditures. That's a good example you would like to draw on. Clearly, tax is not, very often tax people think tax is a name, and it's not a name, it's just a mean. It's a mean to ensure sovereignty, state building, but also to finance a society's model that the countries have to choose. We should never forget about that. That's why I think the rest of the seminar will be quite interesting in terms of how you spend it, what for, what kind of model do you want, and then the tax people are there to find the fundings, which will help building the states and building responsibility, and maybe at some point also get the people more literate in terms of economic and tax and budget matters. So I would like to thank all the panelists for the very interesting inputs today, and I invite you all to go to the George Marshall room in the Chateau to enjoy the lunch. Thank you very much.